Hello, and welcome to Race and Racism, Lecture 11. Today we're going to be discussing all of those you see before you, starting with Charles Mills in perhaps one of the best papers, in my opinion, written in the past 50 years in philosophy. So, a little background is in order. Epistemology is a philosophical discipline. It studies knowledge, roughly speaking. And traditionally, it's been focused just on the analysis of knowledge, that is, what it is and when we have it. For example, some defend knowledge as justified true belief that you don't have by luck. So, for instance, I know that my hand's in front of me because I can see it, and that is, I'm justified. I believe it, and it's true, and it's not really like a lucky situation. It's just something that as a matter of fact, is true, and I know it for good reasons. So that's the sort of approach that traditional epistemology has pursued when studying knowledge. Mills is suggesting this is more or less an idealized way of approaching knowledge, but epistemology is supposed to be useful because knowledge is useful. I mean, we assert things, we act on things, we know things, we seek knowledge, but idealizations are typically too useful. They're like frictionless planes in physics. There are no such things. I mean, they can be helpful abstractions, but when you get down to the concrete reality, you need something a little dirtier, that is to say, a little more complex. So focusing on knowledge this way is not particularly obviously helpful, and Mills thinks it's not helpful at all, actually. In fact, focusing just on the positive side of knowledge really obscures ignorance, what it is and when we have it, and importantly, why it's important. So, as I've said again and again, we believe and want many things we didn't choose to want or believe, and we learn them from childhood. We believe dogs are mammals, that penguins can't fly, but but they're birds anyway. We want to eat cow steak, but not horse steak. We believe all sorts of things, right? They're embedded in other beliefs and desires. If Sam learns at an early age, for instance, that people of color are bad, then Sam may build on many other beliefs on top of that. I also believe it's okay for bad people to suffer and want them to suffer as well, a desire which of course may serve as a foundation for many other desires. In this way, beliefs and desires are embedded. And beliefs inform desires, and they output in actions. There are at least two ways in which beliefs themselves, regardless of how they're embedded, can go wrong. You can believe something, but it be false. You can have no belief about it, but it's true anyway, and important. Just to remind you of the terminology, that first one is false belief, and the second is ignorance, at least as we've been using them in this class. There's another sort of category we should reflect on. So desires, too, inform beliefs. And the result also outputs an action. We call these things wishful thinkings, or an agent is engaged in wishful thinking with respect to some proposition P just in case they believe P is true because they want to. For example, somebody might discover that her partner has been unfaithful, but nevertheless want to believe he has been faithful to preserve their marriage or their partnership, and perhaps she's misunderstood the evidence, and so she does. That's what she believes. Beliefs may also be informed by desires not to believe. So not to believe, that your partner's faithful when they're not, but just to ignore it. That also outputs an action. If an agent is ignorant of or suspends belief about some proposition because they do not want to, either implicitly or explicitly, believe it's true, then they're engaged in motivated ignorance, as we'll use it here. And this is the sort of thing, in fact, all of these concepts are the sorts of things that Mills has in mind when he's discussing white ignorance. Roughly speaking, white ignorance is when white individuals have good practical reasons to remain ignorant to the suffering of individuals from marginalized backgrounds and do so. Few want to feel like they're immoral. It's easier to look another way. Plus, there are economic, social, and political benefits, so they don't look very closely at their beliefs. Aspects of white ignorance that Mills discusses include it's sometimes caused by white dominance, that is to say, white people in power. It's sometimes caused by white racism, that is to say, white supremacists. requires the social role of whites to be causally efficacious. This is just to say that that social role has to play some causal or have some causal upshot, continued persistence of ignorance and the harms done to marginalized individuals in community or non-white communities. Now, for 4, individuals may exhibit white ignorance but not be white. We'll be teasing out some of the nuance here in Mills's paper in class. You keep that one in mind, though. Also note that it may create environments in which, say, black ignorance can flourish. Again, we'll flesh out some of the details of that. You might want to look at Mill's paper to get an idea of where we're headed, though. It is a cognitive tendency, white ignorance, rather than an inviolable rule. It's not. This is to say that this is just sort of like a disposition. Not all white people are always ignorant. Not all white people are mostly ignorant in the sense meant here. It can be violated. People can do better. It's just a strong tendency to remain ignorant. It's also generated by a lack of reflection on learned concepts. Concepts, again, we get them from childhood. We get them from our culture, and we don't often get to choose them. It's that combined with a lack of critical reflection that gets people into this sort of bind. And note how pernicious that is and pervasive that is. There are, again, lots of concepts we all have that we don't reflect on. Who has the time? But, of course, not all concepts are supported by such motivated reasoning as white ignorance. The concepts generated by a lack of reflection or sustained by a lack of reflection, they support false beliefs about non-white groups. And that's sort of the key here for white ignorance. Now, it's a privilege, this sort of thing. It's a privileged ignorance. One can be privileged to not feel shame if they don't want to. There are other privileges associated with it, of course, material wealth, moral status, power. None of this is new information. In fact, I mentioned it just a moment ago. What is new, what we are going to add a little bit here too in Mill's discussion is some of the types of resistance that you might see. Here's an example. When presented with the evidence of racist beliefs or concepts, some simply avoid the topic. They might change the subject or claim the topic is inappropriate for the present discussion. I think in some cases this is the right thing to do. If I'm literally trying to put out a fire, it's probably not the best time to discuss race relations in the U.S. Nevertheless, this is an extreme example. In many cases, like at a relaxed dinner with friends, this seems an appropriate topic. This is an example of what's called the evasion strategy. In such context, it seems like it's motivated resistance. There's another. Some insist issues stemming from white ignorance are not about race, but entirely, say, about class or economic disparities. In conversation after conversation, people question whether race is a cause of marginalization. This is a resistance strategy called different causes. Lastly here, people who exhibit racist beliefs or concepts are viewed as not blameworthy because they simply don't know any better. Remember, where did we get these views? I don't know. Where did we get these beliefs? I don't know, right? I didn't choose them. Defenders will say something like, a morally good person like X couldn't possibly be racist. The conclusion of this sort of reasoning in this context is often that privileged whites aren't blameworthy and aren't responsible for the views they hold. This is called the moral purity strategy. I'd like for you to reflect before class, if you get a chance to, on examples in which you've experienced someone using these strategies in relevant conversations. And then that's after you've done that easier question, because I'm sure many of you have seen these strategies in action. Think about the harder question. Have you ever used them to avoid conversation about tough topics? It's okay if you have. Sometimes you just shouldn't pursue a conversation, and maybe these are useful strategies to get out of that conversation. Sometimes maybe people have put you in a situation to have a conversation about a topic that you just don't feel comfortable having, and maybe this is a quick and dirty way out of it. I mean, they're heuristics, they're strategies. They're supposed to be neutral. They can just be used poorly just as well as they can be used well. So think about that second question. Have you ever used these strategies to avoid a conversation about a tough topic? All right, let's move over here to Crenshaw, demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex. Now, again, a little preliminary here about the justice system. Unfortunately, excellent example of the sort of like inertia, that is the sustained ignorance one sees in white ignorance, is in the U.S. court system. In the U.S., juries rule on matters of fact while judges rule on matters of law. This is to say, prosecutors will bring evidence to juries and the juries will say, that's true or that's false, or I believe that or I don't. And once that has been settled in criminal cases, the judges dish out punishment or not. Now, judges abide by a principle called stare decisis. I'm not exactly sure. And in Latin, like the Latin, it would be pronounced something like stare decisis. But, I'm not sure what British Latin would say about it, so we'll just say SD for now. This roughly means, though, importantly, the preservation of legal decisions of other judges as much as possible. And this is set in stone as precedent. It's built into the court system. It's a resistance to changing doctrines. It's one of the reasons why it takes so long to change laws. Judges can, of course, change laws by deciding they're outdated, but the conservativity of the courts means change is likely to be resisted by other judges who may try to overturn the change. Again, this is a sort of inertia against change. It's a resistance built into the court system itself. Now, consider this case raised by Crenshaw now, in which black women were brought a wrongful firing suit against General Motors, claiming the company did not hire black women. The court ruled that General Motors did, in fact, hire black women because they hired black men and white women. And so if you put those together, men and women, black and white, they hired black women. So that was their conclusion. You couldn't just, they said, artificially construct a case or like a class of black women to get a discrimination suit off the ground. Now, I think as a logical aside here, this is absurd. Note this: if something is P and something is Q, then something is P and something is Q. That follows as a matter of logic. This is what the plaintiffs meant, right? Black women. Now, if something is P and something is Q, it doesn't follow that something is P and Q. That should make sense too. This is what the court heard. These are logically distinct directions of the sentence. It's pretty clear what the plaintiffs meant. They were just not heard. Here's a brief discussion of the legislative history surrounding Title 7 does not indicate, according to the courts, that the goal of the statute was to create a new classification of black women who would have greater standing than, for example, a black male. The prospects of the creation of the new class of protected minorities, governed only by the mathematical principles of permutation and combination, clearly raises the prospects of opening the hackneyed Pandora's box. All this is legal, not even legal. This is just nonsense rhetoric to say, look, if we let you just combine black and combine women under the protection of Title 7, then wow. We'd just be able to combine all sorts of different combinations to get special status. And all of those independent statuses, or all of those permutations of statuses, would be protected under the law. Oh, what a terrible world we live in. In this case, where Moore was involved, a suit was presented claiming that black women were being sexually discriminated against, but the courts did not recognize the discrimination targeted against black women. And in their rulings, it was because they did not read that discrimination suit as targeting women. They did not make the inference, as one reasonably should, that a subpopulation of women being targeted was targeting women. Again, the lack of a concept of a black woman and legal standing under Title VII obscured actual harms going on. There were women being targeted by sexual discrimination. It's just when a case was brought to court that said black women and put black women to the fore, it was ignored. In a different direction, where ignoring got in the way, or at least helped in this case, this tribunal was a victory for black women plaintiffs who received back pay stemming from discrimination, but the victory was only achieved after they narrowed the scope of their suit to black women. It was originally for all black employees. The lack of legal resources here, that is, concepts in play, in that respect, legal resources, that forced plaintiffs to pick either race or sex to leverage against discriminating companies, but not both. This brings it all together. To bring this back to a non-metaphorical level, Crenshaw writes, I'm suggesting that black women can experience discrimination in ways that are both similar to and different from those experienced by white women and black men. Black women sometimes experience discrimination in ways similar to white women's experiences. Sometimes they share very similar experiences with black men. Yet often they experience double discrimination, the combined effect of practices which discriminate on the basis of race and on the basis of sex. And sometimes they experience discrimination as black women, not the sum of race and sex discrimination, but as black women. Again, a different categorization, one that should be recognized in the courts. In addition to compounding these harms, Crenshaw is observing that the legal existence of black women just wasn't permitted, which, if we bridge this back to Mill's discussion of white ignorance, suggests an acknowledged gap in information here in the court system, a gap in conceptual resources that cover black women, a legal principle in place that preserves that ignorance. And though Mills focused on dynamics between white people and non-white groups in his essay, the structure proposed by Crenshaw's, if we combine Crenshaw's insights, is fully general. Roughly, identities which maintain power in a given situation have vested practical interest in maintaining ignorance. Power creates inertia and tends towards more power. Recall, these were the features of white ignorance. We might adjust them following Crenshaw along axes of identity. Here's these highlighted red portions. That's where I've made the changes. Axis of identity ignorance, I'm calling this, is sometimes caused by identity power. The paradigmatic example here, white identity power, right? That would be the cause. Sometimes caused by identity prejudice. It requires the social role of that identity in 1 and 2 to be causally efficacious in the generation of 1 and 2. It may exhibit identity ignorance, but not identification with the identity of the group. It may create environments in which out-group ignorance can flourish as well, and it's also a cognitive tendency generated by a lack of reflection, and it supports false beliefs about out-groups. And here we can add to Crenshaw supplementing Mill's discussion with more Crenshaw, namely by viewing intersectional oppressions and its targets at the heart of broader systematic and systems of subordination, which we turn to next. And Crenshaw's Beyond Racism and Misogyny. Now, there are 3 aspects of subordination relevant to discussing intersectionality. There's structural, political, and representation. We'll start here. An analysis of subordination at this level examines the intersections of oppressions as they compound harms. Crenshaw provides an example of poverty, lack of job skills, passive discrimination, etc., that weigh on battered women of color attempting to escape the cycle of abuse. The social support system is often blind to how these harms aggregate. Turning to political consequences of structural dominance. The analysis of subordination at this level examines the intersection of oppressions as they erase those at the intersections. For example, the rhetoric surrounding the debates over the Violence Against Women Act in '91 centered on white individuals, or white women, that is, because violence against women didn't just, quote, occur in the inner cities. At the representational level, we see this examines intersections of oppressions as forefront narratives about those in the intersection. Crenshaw provides several examples from film of, say, hypersexualized women and men of color and illustrates the dangers of miscegenation. Here, in each of these cases, she writes, and the specific image is created within the intersection of race and gender, although some claim that these images reflect certain attitudes that make women of color targets of sexual violence, the actual effect of images on behavior is still hotly contested. Whatever the relationship between the imagery and actions is, it seems clear that these images do function to create counter-narratives to the experiences of women of color that discredit their claims and render the violence they experience unimportant. These images not only represent the evaluation of women of color, they may also reproduce it by providing viewers with both conscious and unconscious cues for interpreting the experiences of others. Because both the actual experiences of violence and the representation of those experiences constitute the problem of gender violence, feminists of color must address how race and gender intersect in popular discourse, as well as in feminist and anti-racist politics. This all sort of comes to the fore in the discussion of the Two Live Crew album, Nasty, which was labeled obscene by those in power. Charges of obscenity in the court system apply largely when works are deemed prurient or immoral to a wide audience or lack cultural value and involve offensive sexual activity. Now, the Two Live Crew was targeted despite the fact that Madonna and Andrew Dice Clay, who worked at the same time and were arguably very obscene, were not. They were never brought up for charges of obscenity, despite all the things they did. Moreover, there did not seem to be widespread outrage about the album. Courts rejected claims that the album had cultural value because the putative claims of value appealed to were deemed universal. Nevertheless, the album was, however, full of sexually offensive material. It was also full of sexual violence and misogyny, but the obscenity charge obscured the violence of the lyrics by focusing on the sex. From a representational level, if we work our way backwards, it reinforced black women as the targets of both sex and violence discrimination, whether by triggering responses to the white public's imagery of what black or how black women were perceived, illustrating that those stereotypes still exist, or by glorifying them. From a political level, the emphasis on sex via obscenity generalized the target from black women to all women. And from a structural level, the courts and the publics are, as they always have been, blind to the intersection of political and representation harms to black women, owing both to the album and the court cases. This, of course, I think leads naturally into Angela Davis's work. Because you might be thinking, well, look, we've made progress in recent years. Two Live Crew was so long ago. And it does, I remember when the album was out. It does seem quite a bit ago, and music has changed. Film has changed quite a bit, and there's quite a bit more respect. Awareness has grown concerning intersectional oppressions too, both in the legal system and in the broader public. And I mean, it's no question it's largely due to Crenshaw's excellent work. This is quite true, I think. We should give credit to progress, but we shouldn't lose sight of history, because it also reminds us of what goals we had, but we may have forgotten once progress was made. Angela Davis is observing in this article how influential celebration of historical events can be. They often suggest closure in the form of touchstones, almost as if we can point back and say, look at what we did. Celebration, for example, of Martin Luther King, a national holiday, might suggest to some that what MLK saw for our future was accomplished. Touchstones to commemorate victories, though, can become opportunities for sustaining subordination. MLK's dream speech doesn't reflect the nuance of his criticism of U.S. culture. Surely we are not done. And to focus on that message, just that message, that abstraction, away from the content, just to focus on that waters it down. You should reflect, if you don't mind, on Malcolm X's line in his letter to the grassroots about mixing cream and coffee and what happens to the message. More recently, the presidency of Barack Obama signaled to many a sign of celebration, with media outlets more or less literally saying things like racism is over. But power always, remember this, power tends towards power. It is inertial. Now let's bring this together. Mills illustrated how white ignorance supports white dominance. Crenshaw's exploration of intersectional oppression generalized Mills' observations. Crenshaw's analysis of subordination illustrates structural, political, and representational aspects of that dominance, and how difficult it is to fight against it and even live in it. Now Davis is observing further another hurdle to overcome, that victories, even the victories, can be used against you. Because freedom, and this is the title of the essay, right? Real, unflinching, unabashed freedom is a constant struggle. If you're comfortable, then someone somewhere who deserves freedom is not. That's the world we live in. Someone is being exploited, not because of your comfort, but because our social and political realities are exploitative. Let's try with a bit of history, with Davis's example pulled from the Black Panther Party's 10-point program. outlining plausible demands one might make against a dominating power, repeating a cycle of subordination and abuse against subcommunities. Freedom, full employment, an end to capitalist robbery of oppressed communities, decent housing, genuine education of history and our role in society. How many of these demands have been met, do you think? Have we made progress on any of them? Think about 4 and 5. This is 5 of the 10. Free health care, end to police brutality of oppressed people in the U.S., end to foreign wars of aggression, freedom of oppressed peoples from federal prisons, etc., land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and control over modern technology. How many of these have been met? Have we made progress? Look at 6, 7, and 10. We'll talk soon.